Welcome, aviation enthusiasts and history buffs, to Classic Duels, a captivating mini documentary series that takes you deep into the heart of the adrenaline pumping battles that unfolded in the skies during World War II. In this episode, we are in the skies above the Australian city of Darwin in 1943, and we're going to talk about the controversial clashes between the Supermarine Spitfire and a regular foe in the Classic Duels series, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero. The Supermarine Spitfire and the Mitsubishi A6M Zero were two of the most iconic fighters of World War II, each representing the pinnacle of British and Japanese aviation engineering at the time. These aircraft, designed for very different operational needs, faced each other in combat over Australia in the Southwest Pacific Theatre, where both the British Royal Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force clashed with the Imperial Japanese Navy. These engagements provided critical lessons in aerial combat tactics and technological strengths and weaknesses, shaping the evolution of air combat strategy during the war. And I'll also mention that in the Burma campaign, the Spitfire's main adversaries were Ki-43 Hayabusas and Ki-44 Tojos of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force. By early 1942, the Japanese had launched a swift and aggressive expansion across the Pacific, capturing Singapore, the Philippines, and much of the Dutch East Indies, or modern-day Indonesia. This rapid advance brought the Japanese military to the doorstep of northern Australia. On February 19, 1942, the Japanese launched the first air raid on Darwin, marking the beginning of a prolonged aerial campaign over the region. The initial attack, carried out by carrier-based aircraft from the Imperial Japanese Navy and two land-based bomber groups, caused heavy damage to military installations and infrastructure. Throughout 1942, the Royal Australian Air Force, or RAAF, and a small contingent of Allied air units struggled to defend Darwin against repeated Japanese air raids, which were primarily flown from Japanese bases in the Dutch East Indies. And one of the main Japanese aircraft used in these raids was, of course, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, one of the most advanced fighters of its time. However, by early 1943, the situation would start to change when the Australian Air Force P-40 Warhawks would be replaced with a formidable new defender, the Mark V Spitfire, which would be operated by the Royal Australian Air Force's No. 1 wing, led by the legendary Australian P-40 ace, Clive Coldwell. The Spitfire was a legendary British fighter that had proven its superiority in the Battle of Britain in 1940. By 1943, the Spitfire Mark V was the main variant in service with the Allies. While it had superior diving speed and high altitude performance compared to the Zero, the Spitfire Mark V faced some difficulties in the harsh tropical conditions of northern Australia, where its short range, narrow undercarriage, and issues with overheating posed operational challenges. The A6M Zero was the dominant Japanese naval fighter of the early war years. It had a reputation for extreme agility, long range, and lethality, so it was a serious threat to any Allied aircraft it came up against. However, the Zero had significant weaknesses. Not only was it slower than the Spitfire, but it also lacked armour protection for the pilot and fuel tanks, so it was highly vulnerable to well-placed fire from heavier armed opponents like the Spitfire. By early 1943, the No. 1 wing of the Royal Australian Air Force, consisting of No. 54 Squadron of the Royal Air Force and No. 452 and 457 squadrons of the Royal Australian Air Force, had arrived in Darwin equipped with Spitfires, placing P-40 Warhawks in the process. On March 2nd, 1943, Mark 5C Spitfires of the No. 1 Fighter Wing and A6M2 Zeros of the 202nd Air Group clashed for the first time when the Zeros were performing a low-level raid on the airfield at Kumali Creek, south of Darwin, resulting in the loss of one stationary Beaufighter. 26 Spitfires scrambled to intercept the incoming formation, climbing rapidly to gain an altitude advantage, but the Zero squadron leader led his formation down to low level, so they could avoid both the Spitfires and radar. This resulted in 20 of the Spitfires searching the skies south of Darwin long after the Zeros had returned home, so only 6 Spitfires that were led by Clive Caldwell were in a position to intercept the retiring Zeros, and by the time they found the Zeros, they had been in the air for 90 minutes and only had 30 gallons of fuel left. So, what ended up happening was a dogfight where the Spitfire survived being bounced by some inexperienced Zero pilots that had used up most of their ammunition, and no Spitfires or Zeros were shot down, but a couple of the Zeros were damaged. As inconclusive as this engagement was, it still proved that while the Spitfire was the superior aircraft in general, the Zero was a more agile and reliable aircraft, and the Japanese pilots had better tactics. On the 2nd of May in 1943, the number 1 fighter wing lost 14 Spitfires and 2 pilots, some of which were lost due to running out of fuel. It was due to the relatively poor performance in these earlier engagements that there were leadership discussions and a memo on Spitfire tactics, with the main points being: pilots should concentrate on easier low deflection shooting, avoid getting into turn fights with the Zeros, and use more boom and zoom tactics which played to the Spitfire's strengths. Numerical disadvantage was acceptable as the Spitfire had the speed to disengage when necessary. Short engagements were necessary due to the Spitfire's limited endurance, and that line abreast fours should be the new tactical formation. However, despite these valid points and poor results, Clive Caldwell still had a preference for his barrel-bow interceptions. While these barrel-bow or big wing tactics ensured numerical superiority, forming up used up precious time and fuel. Following the controversial engagement on the 2nd of May, the next big raid didn't occur until the 20th of June in 1943, when the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force performed its only raid on Darwin. This involved the Australian Spitfires attacking Ki-49 Helens and Ki-48 Lilies and getting into combat with the escorting Ki-43 Oscars. While the number 1 fighter wing were able to make more than 30 passes at the Japanese bombers, the Spitfires would still be plagued by mechanical issues, underperforming engines, and the common faults of both the Spitfire's cannons and constant speed unit failing. So, like with the Zero pilots, the Ki-43 pilots were able to inflict losses on the Spitfires and done a good job in protecting the bombers, with only 2 Ki-49 Helens shot down and all the Ki-48 Lilies returning to their base in Timor. The last time that Spitfires and A6M Zeros would clash would be on the 7th of September. The Spitfires, plagued by communication failures, would end up getting bounced by the Zeros, resulting in 3 Spitfires being shot down for the loss of just 1 Zero. The last Zero mission over Australia occurred on the 27th of September, when just 4 Zeros escorted 21 KL-48 Lily bombers in an attack on a couple of different airfields. After these missions, the only aerial activity was the odd reconnaissance mission or night raid, and the very last Japanese attack on Australia occurred at night on the 11th of November, when a Betty containing 2 senior Japanese officers was shot down by a Spitfire night fighter. By late 1943, Japan had scaled down attacks on northern Australia so they could prioritise other objectives, and the Mark V Spitfires were replaced by Mark VIII Spitfires, which had superior high altitude performance. However, apart from the odd Japanese reconnaissance flight or bomber, the Mark VIII Spitfires were mainly used in ground attack missions on Morotai Island. The air battles over Darwin in 1943 were some of the most intense dogfights in the Pacific theatre. While the Zero remained dangerous, the arrival of the Spitfire would start to shift the balance of power. The Spitfire had better speed and high altitude performance, while the Zero retained its legendary agility and long range. The fighter losses over Darwin in 1943 would indicate a solid victory for the Japanese, with 38 Spitfires destroyed in exchange of only 5 Zeros lost and 1 Ki-43 Hayabusa. However, these Spitfire losses are skewed by the high number of Spitfires that were lost due to mechanical failure and fuel shortages. Plus, another factor worth mentioning is that Japanese records are not as detailed as Allied records, so there's a good chance that a number of Zeros that returned to base damaged were subsequently written off. One of the main problems when analysing the No. 1 fighter wing's performance is that the Mark 5C Spitfires were plagued by serious technical issues in the tropical climate, especially with their constant speed units and Hispano cannons. So there's a chance that without these issues, Japanese would have lost more fighters and they definitely would have lost more bombers. Compared to the Spitfire pilots, the Zero pilots were better organised and disciplined when it came to formation flying. Plus, these Japanese pilots had more experience flying together, as the No. 1 fighter wing commenced operations in 1943 with a bunch of newly trained pilots and pilots that had not flown together before. In the Darwin environment, Clive Caldwell's big wing Volvo tactics clearly failed. Not only was excessive fuel used up in forming up, but the big wing formation could easily be seen by the Japanese, thus giving them time to take defensive precautions against it. From a Japanese perspective overall, they succeeded in their goal of launching regular raids against Darwin in 1943, where every one of those raids featured Japanese bombers being well defended by the A6M Zero escorts, of which showed impressive reliability and airmanship on these long-range missions. However, in strategic terms, the No. 1 fighter wing was effective in opposing every daylight raid with a major formation of fighters, which must have surprised the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force, who thought they were inflicting more serious losses on the Spitfires, and towards the end of this campaign, there were signs that hard-fought experience was starting to pay dividends within the No. 1 fighter wing. So, if another campaign had started in 1944, the fighter versus fighter combat may well have been a lot more even. So that's it for this glimpse into epic struggles of the past. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you can stay up to date with more riveting tales of aviation history, etc. Check out the 2 videos at the end, all my CD reviews, or even the playlist I've created. Cheers.